The chandelier light in the Royal Ontario Museum's rotunda caught every sequin in the room the night Saskia Hartley watched her marriage die for the second time. She had been dead for 6 months, at least, that's what Lachlan Pryor had been telling Toronto's medical community since the separation. Holdsant, married to her work. The story had spread through hospital hallways with the quiet efficiency of a diagnosis nobody wanted to deliver out loud. She'd heard versions of it from 3 different colleagues before she heard it from him directly. Which was, she supposed, its own kind of answer. The Hartley Pryor Annual Cardiac Care Gala, named for her research funded by her grant applications, populated by her patients and her colleagues, was happening without her. Lachlan had moved the event to a Saturday she'd been locked out of planning. He'd replaced her name on the program with presented by the Pryor Cardiac Foundation. He had brought Amber Connolly in a dress that cost more than a resident's monthly salary, and was leading her through the crowd the way a man leads someone he wants everyone to see. Saskia had not planned to come. Her lawyer Martine had advised against it. Her closest friend at the hospital, Cordelia Nwosu, had called 3 times that afternoon saying, "Don't do this to yourself, Sass, just stay home." Even the woman who'd been quietly building Saskia's comeback for the past 2 months, Romaine Cote, the sharpest reputation specialist in this city, had sent a text at 6:30 that read, "Not yet, wait for my signal." But Saskia had pulled on the one dress she'd bought for herself alone, not for Lachlan, not for an event, just a dress she'd seen in a window on Queen Street West and bought on a Tuesday afternoon, because she'd finally understood that waiting for a reason to wear something beautiful was how you let decades slide past you, while you weren't looking. She gave the car to the valet and walked into the ROM like she'd designed the building herself. 11 years. That was how long it had taken Lachlan Pryor to understand that walking beside Saskia Hartley was easier than walking on his own. She'd met him during residency at Toronto General. He was charming, quick-witted, the kind of man who made hospital cafeteria food seem like a reasonable place to fall in love. She'd been finishing her cardiac surgery fellowship. He was 2 years behind her, doing internal medicine, talking about pivoting to cardiology once he figured out what he really wanted. She had found his uncertainty endearing at the time. Later she would recognize it for what it was, a man waiting to attach himself to someone with enough momentum to carry them both. She didn't resent having done the heavy lifting. That wasn't who Saskia was. She'd built the private surgical practice from her own reputation, a reputation earned through 11 years of cases no other surgeon in this city had wanted to touch: pediatric heart anomalies, high-risk adult valve replacements, cases where families sat in waiting rooms and prayed to gods they'd stopped believing in, until she came out of the OR and said the words that meant their person was still alive. Lachlan handled the administrative side. He was good at it, genuinely. The partnership meetings, the investor relations, the government grant applications that required someone to sit in a room and be persuasive about funding mechanisms. She was not built for those rooms, she knew it. He knew she needed him, and she had never resented that either. What she hadn't known, what she had apparently been the last person in their social circle to understand, was that he'd been building his exit strategy for nearly 2 years before she discovered it. She found the first thread in February. It wasn't an anonymous tip. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was an expense report she'd only opened because their practice manager was on maternity leave and the quarterly review had landed in Saskia's inbox by mistake. A hotel charge, 4 nights at the Drake, which was 20 minutes from their house, filed under Cardiology Network Conference Hamilton. She knew the Hamilton conference well. She'd presented at it herself 3 years running. It was a 2-day event, always in March. The February charge didn't match anything. She opened the previous quarter, then the one before that. By the time Cordelia arrived at her house that night, with a bottle of something expensive, and the specific expression of a person who already knows what you're about to tell them, Saskia had been sitting at her kitchen table for 4 hours looking at the pattern. "How long have you known?" she asked. Cordelia set the wine on the counter. "A few months. I didn't know how to." "Who is she?" "Amber Connolly. She reps for Mercer Pharma. She's at the hospital 2 or 3 times a week." Saskia absorbed this. She had a vague image of a woman she'd seen in the cardiology wing, blonde, young, the kind of easy, uncomplicated attractiveness that didn't seem to require anything of you. "He's been using practice funds," she said. Cordelia sat down. "I know. That's not marital assets, that's embezzlement from a medical practice." "I know, Sass." She didn't cry that night. She wasn't ready for it yet. The grief would come later, would arrive at 3 in the morning in waves she hadn't prepared for, would knock her sideways in the shower and in the car, and at one mortifying moment during rounds, when a nurse asked if she was all right, and she'd had to excuse herself to the stairwell for 4 minutes. But that night at the kitchen table, she was still in the clinical part of her brain, cataloging, assessing. The mind of a surgeon who has learned that panic is the most useless thing you can bring into an operating room. She called Lachlan from the kitchen while Cordelia sat across from her. He came home within the hour, and his face when he walked in and saw the open laptop and the printed expense reports. His face told her everything. "How long?" she asked. He didn't try to lie. That surprised her. She'd braced for denial and instead got something almost worse. Relief, the expression of a man who'd been carrying something heavy and was glad to finally set it down. 14 months. 14 months. She did the math without meaning to. The Hamilton conference excuse had been 12 months ago. He'd started hiding it 2 months before that. "I want a separation," he said. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. I'm entitled to half the practice." Half the practice. Not "I'm sorry," not "I don't know what happened to us," just the asset claim, ready-made, laundered through months of quiet preparation. "You used practice funds to finance this," she said. "That's your interpretation." "That's a forensic accountant's interpretation. I've already made the call." Something shifted in his face. The relief flickered. "Saskia. Don't." She closed the laptop. "Just tell me when you want to move out." He moved out that weekend. She went to the hospital on Saturday and performed a 6-hour valve replacement, and told herself that the building didn't care about her marriage. It cared about whether she did the mathematics correctly. The article appeared in the Globe and Mail 3 weeks later, in the Saturday Life section. She found it on her phone while eating toast alone at the kitchen table, a ritual she maintained out of pure stubbornness, because stopping felt like admitting something. The headline, "Heart of the Matter, Lachlan Pryor on Medicine Loss and Starting Over." There was a photograph of him at a cafe on Ossington, looking thoughtful in the way men look thoughtful when a photographer has spent 20 minutes coaching the expression. Amber was not in the photo, but the caption mentioned his partner, Amber Connolly, a healthcare consultant. Healthcare consultant. She was a pharmaceutical sales representative. The distinction was doing a great deal of work. The article described Lachlan as a visionary in cardiac care who spent years supporting his partner's demanding surgical career, often at the cost of his own professional development. It quoted him saying, "Medicine was always Saskia's first love. I understood that. But a marriage can't survive indefinitely as someone's third priority, after the hospital and the research." Third priority. She had worked herself into the ground building a practice that carried his name alongside hers. She had cancelled twice as many social engagements as he had. She had never once in 11 years told him that his administrative contributions were less valuable than her surgical ones, because she genuinely hadn't believed that. But he had believed it. He'd been performing resentment for years. She now understood, and she'd been too busy saving lives to notice the performance. Her phone rang continuously for 2 days. Colleagues with careful voices. Her sister in Calgary who'd always had quiet reservations about Lachlan, and was now expressing them with the restrained satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting. A journalist from a medical trade publication asking for comment. She declined all of it. The hospital was harder to avoid. She found out through Cordelia that Lachlan had been meeting with the board about the practice's research structure, specifically about whether the grants she'd won could be transferred to a new entity. Her name was on every grant. The methodology was hers entirely, but he'd been listed as co-investigator on the administrative paperwork, which meant he had standing to make a claim. She sat in her office and looked at the framed certificates on the wall and thought about the years each one represented. The CIHR Pediatric Valve Study, the Heart and Stroke Foundation Research Award. Every one of them had come from her ideas, her proposals, her late nights translating surgical knowledge into the language of funders, which was its own exhausting kind of work that nobody saw. She called Romain Cote that afternoon. Romain's office was in a building on Bay Street that suggested serious money being made in very quiet rooms. She was 52, small, and possessed the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades listening to people underestimate her. "Tell me everything," she said, "from the beginning, don't edit." Saskia told her, the expense reports, the article, the board meetings, the grant paperwork. She spoke in the clipped, precise way she reported surgical complications, emotion managed below the surface, facts arranged in order of severity. Romain listened without interrupting. "2 questions," she said when Saskia finished. "First, how much of the practice's reputation is directly attributable to you, and can you prove it? Every patient outcome, every case study, every published paper. My name is primary author on all of it." Second, when did his relationship with Amber Connolly actually begin? Saskia frowned. He said 14 months ago. That's when it became consistent. Affairs don't begin on a single Tuesday. They begin 6 months earlier, when someone starts paying attention to a different person. Romain leaned forward. I want to know what he was doing 20 months ago. Because if the timeline predates his claimed narrative of neglect, if he wasn't driven to someone else by an absent wife, but was actively pursuing another relationship while you were building your shared future, then the story he sold to the Globe falls apart entirely. How do you find that? I have a forensic communications analyst. She smiled slightly. The same way you have a forensic accountant. Give me 3 weeks. The settlement meeting was on a Thursday morning in a Bay Street boardroom. Saskia arrived with Martine, who had the air of a woman who had sat in too many of these rooms to be impressed by any of them. Lachlan arrived with 2 lawyers and an expression of preemptive reasonableness that she recognized immediately. She'd watched him use it on difficult patients, the face of a man who had already decided the narrative, and was waiting for you to step into it. His lead lawyer, a man named Torrance, polished in a way that felt slightly rehearsed, slid a document across the table. The numbers were extraordinary. 50% of practice assets, 50% of all future grant revenue, a share of the hospital research partnership that bore her name in the founding documents. No, Saskia said. Torrance smiled. Dr. Hartley. No to the grant revenue, no to the research partnership. He was listed as co-investigator on administrative grounds. He contributed nothing to the methodology, the data collection or the interpretation. I have 15 years of surgical records and publication history that demonstrate exactly what I mean by nothing. Lachlan looked at her across the table. That's not fair, Saskia. Neither is billing a hotel at the Drake to our practice account, and calling it a conference in Hamilton. The room went quiet. Torrance gathered himself. My client's contributions to the administrative infrastructure of your shared practice. Your client used practice funds to conduct an affair for at least 14 months. I have a forensic accountant's report. She kept her voice level. I also have evidence that the relationship began significantly earlier than he disclosed, which means the timeline of emotional neglect he offered to the Globe and Mail is not accurate. If you'd like to litigate this in a venue where those facts become public record, I am prepared to do exactly that. Lachlan's composure slipped. You had me investigated. I had our practice's finances audited, standard procedure when a partner exits. She looked at him directly, perhaps for the first time since the kitchen table in February. You've spent 2 months telling this city's medical community that I was cold and absent and married to my work. You gave an interview to a national newspaper calling me someone's third priority. You moved the Gala I built into your own foundation before I'd even finished processing the separation. She heard her voice rise slightly and brought it back down. I will not sit here and let you take my research on top of all of that. Torrance murmured something to Lachlan. Lachlan murmured something back. Perhaps Torrance said, we should take a short recess. Outside in the hallway, Martine scrolled her phone without looking up. That went approximately as expected, she said. I lost my composure. You stated facts with feeling, there's a difference. Martine looked up. They'll come back with a lower number. The expense account documentation changes their calculus. She paused. Romain called me this morning. She found something. What Romain had found was a pattern. Amber Connolly had been the subject of an informal complaint at a Brampton hospital 18 months ago. A complaint filed by the wife of a chief of medicine who had ended his marriage following a relationship with Amber. Before that, a similar situation at a clinic in Mississauga. Both men had been senior physicians. Both had been married. Both had subsequently hired Amber in professional capacities after their divorces. She targets men with established medical reputations, Romain told Saskia. She's very skilled at it. Your husband isn't the first person to believe he found something genuine. Does this change anything legally? Not directly, but it changes the story. The story right now is that your career drove a devoted husband into someone else's arms. The story I can build is that a woman with a documented pattern moved into your marriage while you were saving children's lives. Romain paused. One of those stories generates sympathy for Lachlan. The other generates fury on your behalf. Choose which one this city reads. The Rom Gala was in October. Saskia had attended every year for a decade, first as a +1 then as a featured donor, eventually as the person the event called when they needed a keynote speaker who could hold a room. Romain had told her to come. Cordelia had told her not to. Martine had been neutral in that deliberate way that meant she'd already mapped both outcomes. Saskia put on the dress. Deep burgundy, architecturally simple. The kind of garment that required nothing except standing up straight, and thought about all the events she'd attended as half of something. She had been patient and accommodating and skilled at dimming herself by 2 degrees whenever Lachlan was in the room, because she'd never wanted to make him feel small. She understood now what that generosity had cost her. The car dropped her at the museum entrance. Photographers were there, local society press, a photographer from a medical journal she recognized. She walked up the steps without hurrying. Inside, the rotunda glittered. She accepted a glass of wine from a passing tray and moved through the crowd the way she moved through a hospital, purposefully, without performance. Dr. Femi Adewale stopped her near the East Gallery. He was chief of surgery at Sunnybrook and had known her for 15 years. He looked at her with the expression of someone choosing their words. "You're here," he said. "Why wouldn't I be? I should have called you when that Globe piece ran. I've known you since your fellowship." He shook his head slightly. "Cordelia sent me your grant publications last week, all of them, with the dates. Every breakthrough attributed to that practice came from your surgical methodology. I don't know how I let the narrative get away from me." More conversations followed. A researcher from Western who'd cited her pediatric study, a cardiologist from Ottawa who'd trained under her, and then, a couple she almost didn't recognize at first, standing near the East Wing with a girl of about 7 beside them, the girl holding a small glass of sparkling juice with the gravity of someone attending her first important event. Saskia recognized the parents before she recognized the child. She had operated on that child when she was 4 days old, in a procedure that had taken 9 hours, and that 3 other surgeons in the country had declined to attempt. The girl's heart worked. The recognition function of the evening began at 9. The museum director spoke about donors' research partnerships, the annual Pediatric Cardiac Fund, standard remarks warmly delivered. Then he stopped. He looked at his notes, then out at the room. "Before we close, I want to correct an attribution that should have been corrected a long time ago. The surgical methodology at the foundation of our Pediatric Cardiac Research Fund was developed by one person. Our programming has credited the Hartley-Pryor Partnership, and while partnership has value, I want to be specific tonight about where the science originated." He looked toward her table. "The research is Dr. Saskia Hartley's, her methodology, her protocols, her documented work across 2 decades. Saskia, please." She hadn't expected it. She'd known Romaine had made calls. She hadn't known the director had listened this carefully. She stood. The applause started at the tables near the front, where the medical community was concentrated, and spread outward into the broader donor crowd. People who may not have understood the specifics of cardiac research, but understood clearly that something true was being said publicly, and that the saying of it mattered. Across the room she found Lachlan's face without looking for it. He was standing near the bar with Amber beside him. Neither of them was applauding. He looked like a man who had rehearsed a version of this evening, and was now watching the actual version unfold without him in it. She sat back down. Around her people leaned in with questions, about the research, about the pediatric study, about a foundations board in Vancouver that wanted her for a keynote. She answered all of it. She was present in a way she hadn't been at one of these events in years, maybe ever, because she'd always been half attending, while the other half of her mind stayed at the hospital. Eventually Lachlan appeared at her elbow. The crowd had thinned just enough. "Saskia Asia." "Lachlan." The director's remarks, he stopped. "I didn't expect that." "Neither did I." "I'm not trying to take your research," he said it quietly, in the register he used when he meant something. "I just want to be able to move forward. Then tell your lawyers that the grant revenue is mine and the research rights are mine, and the expense account documentation exists regardless of whether either of us wants it to become a matter of public record." A long silence. "You'd actually bring it to court. You told a national newspaper that I was your third priority." She held his gaze. "After everything I built, after every night I came home and asked how your day was, and listened and believed that we were building something together. Yes, Lachlan, I would bring it to court." He looked away first. Amber appeared beside him then, deliberately, Saskia thought, in the way people do when they've been watching from a distance, and decide that presence is better than waiting. "I just want you to know," Amber began, "that what happened between Lachlan and me, nothing you're about to say will be useful to either of us." Saskia said it pleasantly, the way she spoke to medical students defending a wrong answer. "But I will tell you this. The 2 men before Lachlan, the situations in Brampton and Mississauga, their practices didn't survive the restructuring either. You might want to think carefully about what that pattern suggests for where you're standing right now. Something complicated moved across Amber's face. Saskia set her wine glass on a passing tray. She looked at the two of them, Lachlan's careful composure, Amber's reassessing eyes, and felt nothing that resembled grief. Just the clean, quiet space that opens when you finally stop wanting something to be different than it is. "Good night," she said. She found Cordelia near the exit and they left together, stepping out onto Bloor Street into the particular October cold that Toronto does so honestly, clear and sharp and completely indifferent to whatever you're going through. "You good?" Cordelia asked. Saskia thought about it. The grant certificates on her office wall, the 7-year-old girl with the working heart who'd been holding a small glass of sparkling juice, like she had somewhere important to be, the research she'd built from nothing that would outlive this marriage, this gala, and every version of Lachlan prior that had ever existed, without her propping it up. "Yeah," she said, "I actually am." 6 months later, Martine called with the final settlement numbers. Lachlan had accepted 28% of liquid practice assets. No grant revenue, no research rights, no future claims on any methodology developed during or after the partnership. The forensic accounting report had been, as Martine put it, persuasive. Saskia signed the papers at her new clinic, a space she'd taken on her own near St. Michael's Hospital, modest by the standards of what she'd shared with Lachlan, but hers in every room and down to every instrument tray. The letterhead read Hartley Cardiothoracic Center, just the one name. She'd looked at it for a long time the first morning the stationery arrived, longer than was probably necessary, and then she'd put it away and got to work. She'd heard through the residency grapevine that Lachlan's new practice was struggling. Patients who'd assumed the prior name carried surgical weight had quickly learned the distinction between the surgeon and the administrator. Whether he and Amber would find their footing was not a calculation she spent time on. She didn't wish him harm. She wasn't generous enough to wish him well. She had simply arrived at the place where he occupied no particular space in her thinking, where he'd become background noise in a life she was building with both hands. She turned back to the file open on her desk. A 9-year-old in Oakville with a congenital defect her previous cardiologist had called inoperable. 3 other surgeons in the province had reviewed the imaging and agreed. Saskia looked at the scans for a long time. She turned the problem over the way she always had, methodically, without panic, in the certainty that impossible problems yield to patient thinking. The building didn't care about her marriage. It cared about whether she did the mathematics correctly. She picked up her pen and began.